and then get moving towards the.
Okay, and I'll just start off by saying this is another in our series of CFA Incubator webinars. We've been running the incubator over the course of 2020, and Natrx was one of the 5 projects selected for a small subgrant, and we've been really enjoying working with them and watching their evolution over the course of the last year, and really exciting opportunities ahead, I believe. And so, Leonard will be giving a presentation, and then afterwards we'll have plenty of time for Q&A as usual. Please type in your questions in the chat box, or you can raise your hand, and we'll pick on you to unmute your mic, and you can put your video on if you'd like and ask your question directly. And so we look forward to a good discussion afterwards. And without further ado, over to you, Leonard.
Thanks, David. And a quick question. So we're 6 minutes in. What time should I shoot for to wrap up the presentation portion?
Well, we usually presentations will go to about half past, giving about half an hour of discussion, but 20 minutes of discussion is plenty. So if you feel that you want to talk a little longer, you're welcome to. It's interesting stuff, but no need,
Okay.
So totally up to you. Yep.
Sounds good. Well, we, what I wanted to accomplish is give everybody an overview and share a bit of our growth being part of the CFA Incubator. So it's been very rewarding, and I think we've made great relationships and huge strides as a business. So when we applied, I think we had revenue to that point, the prior 2 years was maybe 105 grand, 110 grand. And, last year last 12 months, we've done about 550K, and we'll probably do 1.5 million this year, kind of depending on what projects we get out the door before New Year's. So a lot of growth on the top line and a lot of better understanding of the market needs and how financing can fit into the picture. And content-wise, I'd like to touch on just overall what are we trying to do, and then highlight quickly some of the new energy concepts. There's some exciting things in wind and solar, but we don't want to repeat the same problems that we had or that we created by putting our transportation infrastructure and our traditional infrastructure in for last generation energy technologies when we transition. So we'll touch on that. And if we have a time, we might talk a bit about some coral concepts as well for coral reef restoration. So there's a quote, software is eating the world. It's kind of a famous technology quote. I don't think that's true. In reality, infrastructure is eating the world. So looking at, and this is a bit of a busy chart, and some of you may have seen this paper in Nature, but global biomass, you can see it here. It's, slightly decreasing or roughly flat, some uncertainty in that. But if you look at man-made mass, so this is your rock, this is your concrete in green, rocks shown in yellow, bricks, asphalt, metal, plastic. We've surpassed all global biomass with anthropogenic materials. So not only does that create a CO, that very CO2 intense, it harms the ability for our natural systems to respond and to provide resilience for coastal protection. So it's hard to wrap your mind around that when you think about how much plankton's in the ocean and biofilms everywhere and bacterial and trees, but that's the state we're in right now. So our business, we think about how can we do this smarter? How can we incorporate nature into infrastructure? How do we help people out there building things, trying to protect communities from storms, get out of this vicious cycle of, sea level rise and climate change adaptations, just building more and more concrete to protect communities as those things, start to bite us. And a little bit of history here. We can kind of jump through that. I think I mentioned some of the revenue numbers, but we're kind of at the crossroads of eco-engineering, advanced manufacturing, and digital construction. We like to play in that kind of that niche, and we offer our customers lower cost and higher performance. And we look to always do things more sustainably. We, just generally speaking, we're looking to reduce the cost, primarily materials, which can be as much of a third of a typical infrastructure project. And for example, versus rock, we can do a project that's much more habitat friendly, and we'll explain this in a bit. Instead of $1 million per linear mile, we can do that for less than 500K per linear mile. So we feel like our clients, they're typically large asset owners, like an energy firm or utility or a municipality. They're kind of expecting and bracing for an enormous cost. And once they find that, hey, you understand that we're under budget pressure, you can almost see the relief. So that's been a big focus of ours during the accelerator, to not just get our costs down, but also how to communicate that to end users. I'm going to kind of skip through a couple of charts here. I might be in the wrong. Yeah, sorry, I was in the wrong deck. So just to kind of highlight some of our successes here, this year after the incubator started, there was tragically a very large hurricane that hit Louisiana, largest hurricane since 1856. Cat 5 hurricane, 150-mile-an-hour winds. And you can see here on the right, a traditional rock breakwater, 10 tons per linear foot. And this is the oyster break, which is a biogenic precast structure, kind of a precursor to our current technology, which you can see performed extremely well. The natural shoreline transition provides a lot of integrity to help protect what's behind it, right? So this project got completely blown up. You can't see it, but the rock is thrown all over the place. The shoreline's disrupted. This is going to be a major repair and a lot of maintenance on that rock. This is more ecologically friendly, more habitat growth, more sand accretion behind it, and much better performance. So this is a kind of a close-up, and you can see some of the habitat growth there. As these things over time, they get stronger and stronger rather than getting weaker and eroding away like a cement seawall might. And you can see from this angle some of the natural sediment accretion. And when you think about, let's say 1 million tons or 1 million tons of sand that you can naturally accrete to protect a community or protect a coastline, even at $25 a ton, which is not that expensive, it doesn't seem that expensive, but at 1 million tons, that's $25 million. So for a Caribbean nation or a cash-strapped municipality, the ability to kind of harness some of these natural systems can be key. And the ability, obviously, to grow things, right? You don't have to pay for something that grows. You don't have to barge it in. You don't have to dredge to get access to the site. This grows on its own, and it provides building materials for free. And finally, kind of the fisheries and the wetlands impact. You look at some of the outlying regions, for example, in the United States. Let's just use our state as an example in North Carolina. We have, I think it's 10 trillion gallons of water, right, in our estuaries. And our oyster reef populations are down 98%, 95 to 98%, kind of depending on who you ask. And that impacts water quality. It impacts habitat area. So if we can restore these, it's very, very clear that we can restore the fisheries. And in North Carolina, the recreational fisheries is a $2 billion business. And there's another $1 billion spent on North Carolinians leaving the state to fish in other places because our estuaries are so distressed. So this is big for coastal communities. These are big for counties that have, $25,000, $30,000 per year family incomes. That's how they can restore their economies and bring people back to work post-COVID. So let me kind of flip through this real quick. So I touched on a few of these. So just to touch on our core technology, we can create modules that can be replacements for monolithic concrete or monolithic rock structures that have void areas and spaces, and a lot of what's called rugosity, which is surface roughness. And that's good for the attraction of sessile organisms like coral or oysters or barnacles. And we're able to do that with a low carbon mix and with naturalistic aesthetics. So looking at a resort hotel in the Caribbean or a coastal system, you really don't want to have something that looks super angular and super manufactured out in front of your beach when you're trying to attract tourists. So we can do some biomimicry and kind of redevelop what used to exist prior to disturbance. So just to give a quick example, this is a section of shoreline. There's some energy infrastructure, a natural gas pipeline in the background, and the wetlands in the foreground have been eroding away. And we were tasked with 800 feet of shoreline protection. And just to kind of compare and contrast the solution here, rock would have been about 200,000, 280 tons of rock. We can get that done with 227 tons of Natrx modules with a more intelligent design that's really mated to that natural shoreline transition. And the fact that you don't have such a heavy barge coming in means you don't have to do dredging, you don't have to do as much trucking. So your energy intensity of the project goes down substantially. And so the question we've been looking at is within the accelerator is, if we can do these projects one time, how can we use that and leverage that into a long-term contract that can be smartly, intelligently financed with asset owners, whether you have a high voltage power line or a shoreline system, or you have a natural gas line running through a wetland area, or maybe a resort hotel. How do we wrap in this kind of a long-term service to do lightweight habitat-based projects to maintain and enhance your asset base at a lower cost over a long period of time? We tend to think it's a bad idea to wait until you're in an emergency and you have to go and do not just 280 tons of rock, but maybe 10,000 tons of rock. And maybe instead of it being $200,000, it's then $20 million because you've waited so long and erosion or sea level rise has impacted you. And we found that asset owners are really, they're open to that kind of approach because what they're looking at is a balance sheet problem. So they have a legacy asset like let's say a crude oil pipeline or a high voltage power line. They have to maintain it. It's still going to be used for the next, say, 15 years as they transition to other energy sources. How do they protect that? And it's a balance sheet issue. If they have to use their income statement dollars to maintain and support that, that doesn't always work for them. So can they take some sort of a balance sheet action, like take out a sustainable impact bond and then do a series of projects to maintain that over time and use nature-based solutions to make it happen? So just some of the served markets right now are primarily working in erosion and storm surge control, living shoreline type approaches, and then some smart dredging and wetlands restoration. And we've really been looking quite heavily at offshore wind, which we'll also touch on in a minute here, and coral restoration. But really, I mean, in the end, there's a lot, about 50% of global GDP is within 50 miles of the coast. So there's a lot of heavy assets that are need to be protected, that are in proximity to water. And based on our heritage and our skills and our technology, we're really focusing on that shoreline to habitat interface and try to do things in a better way. I'm going to kind of skip this chart and just to I think I've kind of already made that point. This is just another example of a proposal here that we're just now doing. Instead of 780 tons of rock, 880 tons of nature-based modules. And instead of destroying wetlands on the shoreline transition, we can help accrete wetlands, help to grow those with a sill. We're now raising funds. We're looking from anywhere from $3 to $10 million in capital to scale up our infrastructure. We've developed this, we have a patented technology to develop these biogenic reef systems. And as you can see in the image here, we're packaging those into a Connex unit. And the idea is that you can then deploy that to the point of need. So for example, we had a conversation down in South Louisiana this year where we looked to price a rock project for 10,000 tons of rock against what we were doing, what we were proposing. And we were told that there was no rock available until 2022. So this was a substantial order. This was about 500 dump truck loads of rock that we were looking at. But none of the suppliers had any rock for the next 18 months. And that's because they had hurricanes come through. And there's times where you just don't have the capacity with rock. And not only is it ecologically damaging in some cases to use rock and more expensive, but if you don't have it, you're really stuck. And if you look at, you look at kind of current trends with storm activity in the Caribbean in particular, you get hurricane after hurricane, 4 named hurricanes in the Gulf Coast this year. And if you can't get rock to protect yourself or protect your assets after they've been disrupted the first time, every storm is going to hit you that much harder. And when you get into situations like oil spills, power outages, then you get into the billions and billions of damages. And so we want to be able to deploy these units to the point of need so that we can take advantage of those market opportunities, but also do it in a more sustainable way. Quick overview of our team. We've grown since we started the project pretty much at the beginning. It's really just Nick, Tyler, Matt, and myself. So we've hired quite a few people, scaled up the operations team, and we've been working a lot more on the digital services as well in terms of how can we use machine learning and drone-based monitoring to better understand the performance of these systems. This is a quick overview of the technology. I don't think we really need to go through this in detail. This is our patent number. But really quickly, we're able to do this differently than the way that people have formed materials since Roman times. So today, typically you take concrete, which is a mix of sand and Portland cement. You mix it into a slurry. So you mix the sand and the water together, and then you pour it into something. And when you do that, it tends to be monolithic. So there's no void spaces, and that's bad for habitat. And it's also higher cost. So this approach allows us to do things differently. And we can basically go in with these needles and we stab the dry material and inject water where we want it to form up. And with about a 15-minute cycle time, we can create a 1 cubic yard structure. And that's, cubic yard structure is about, at market prices, we can sell for about $500 per cubic yard. We can go lower, we can go higher. But when you compare that to rock, which costs usually about $100 per ton and about 2 tons per cubic yard, we can beat rock because we've got a higher performance. We can design it for performance, and we can design it to pack in tighter. So whereas you might need 6 tons of rock for 1 ton of our structure, that allows us to beat rock on price and to beat rock from a sustainability perspective, given the void spaces. So fully digital platform, we can go from digital to physical in about 30 minutes. And that's key for us, the ability to change designs as habitat conditions change and as customer requirements change. In a coral environment, you might want one shape. In an oyster ecosystem, you might want another. In some cases, you might be trying to design for marsh grasses or seagrasses, or to help with dunes. And so there's all kinds of different structures, and we don't have to pay $25,000 to $50,000 to put new molds together to make a new shape. We just change the digital file. We can then put that through our system and then produce it. Kind of the next generation from a software perspective is how do we take this and how do we visualize the habitat response? We find that we can show our clients that, hey, if you do it this way, you're going to destroy all the wetlands, you're going to destroy your shorelines. It's going to be an eroding system that might be kind of weak in a hurricane. If you do it that way, then you get lush habitat, you get all these things growing, you get root systems, you get a strong shoreline interface. Once they see that image, and it really helps to accelerate the sales cycle. I'm going to kind of skip through here real quick. Just to kind of touch on offshore wind and our deployment model. We're looking to deploy these models with a mix of debt and equity. And so the CapEx on our, kind of fund that CapEx through operations or perhaps through upcoming capital raise, and to deploy these up to the point of need. So on the left here, you can see global hotspots in terms of wind energy. And you're really looking to figure out, where are the best spots from a sovereign stability perspective, a regulatory environment and market demand, and where are the areas that the wind's blowing fast, right? So that's not necessarily where the factory might be. So we put these things in that Connex container and get them to the point of need. So as an example, for a given offshore wind farm, those might be 5 million cubic yards of rock that you might dump onto coral systems, for example. And we may be able to replace that with something that restores coral that's very lightweight and fits inside or kind of with the coral infrastructure. And, 1 million tons or 1 million cubic yards at $500 a cubic yard, that's a lot of revenue for us. And it's really all about getting more units out there and finding the right ways to expose that habitat value to our clients, which helps them with, with their goals. It helps the communities with their fisheries and with tourism. And, you know, and it helps to lower the overall cost of getting these new energy transitions to market. So these are kind of our scale up plans, which I'll jump through quickly. We're looking to deploy 1 new unit by the end of this year. Right through this window, we've got our new unit. We're packaging it into a Connex container. That will be going to the Hampton Roads, Virginia area. And then by year end 2022, we'd like to get 2 next generation units out, likely 1 to the Gulf Coast region and 1 to the Caribbean. So I did want to highlight some offshore wind as well. I think that's where I got my slides mixed up a bit. And just a quick visualization showcase as well. We rendered this with, this is a project that we're doing in for an energy company in May. And we rendered this, so these are the reef systems that we're putting in front of an earthworks berm and some newly planted wetlands in the background. And this is the existing revetment that's eroding away next to it. So we'll be able to protect that, create some wetlands as a fringe that'll protect against hurricane that protects this road. But if you look at that difference just in aesthetics alone between what the old way of doing it to the new way, that's huge, right? And we rendered this with Unreal Engine, which is, if you ever heard of the game Fortnite, it's using the gaming engine that that creates those graphics. And, you know, we think that visualization and engagement is going to be a big part of our business as we learn, you know, these various habitat interactions and get better and better at what we can do and how can we move ecosystems forward. So touching on offshore wind, you know, the biggest challenge in offshore wind in the US is approvals. So out of all of the committed offshore wind turbines, only 0.7% of those are actually in the water. The rest are pending. And we had 5 or I think 6 wind projects delayed last year. And typically it's because of environmental impact. So the EIA or EIS, the environmental impact statement. And part of that's because you're dropping rock all over the bottom. Kind of looking at the pain points here, the benthos, which is the bottom, benthic or fisheries impact, benthic biomass, benthic communities are heavily impacted. And really the state of the art today is taking rock and blast mining it or blasting it out of the bottom of the ocean and barging it up and dropping it on the ocean floor. And not surprisingly, communities don't like that. It's not the smartest way, and it's not the most hydrodynamically intelligent way. So what they do is they actually take that rock and dump it at the base of the turbines. And you know, that's for scour protection so that the ocean currents don't undermine or undercut that turbine. And the same thing is done with the cable runs. And on the right here, you can see this is Block Island, Rhode Island, where the Block Island wind farm has an exposed cable where there's a 50,000 volt offshore wind terminal cable that's just sitting on the beach that a recreational boat could run into at any moment. So obviously that's not working well, right? That combination of hydrodynamics and habitat compatibility, rock is not the way to do it. And the way to restore some of these fisheries is to help to make a happy benthos, a happy bottom. So more surface area, substrates that are ecologically and microbially active, right? Things like natural soil has enzymes and bacteria in it that helps with water quality and support fisheries. And dumping rocks, they don't have that, right? That destroys these type of systems. So as we deploy, we look to create systems that don't destroy the benthos and don't destroy ecological transitions. So these are quote unquote engineered products for offshore wind. And if you can see there, especially on the upper right, those systems, you know, this is making things worse, right? We don't want to repeat the same problem that we created with roads and bridges and traditional oil and gas infrastructure with offshore wind, but that's exactly what people are doing today. This is an example of an exposed offshore wind cable. That's not a smart way to do it. We can do better. So just as an example here of a biogenic cable armoring redesign. So what if we can design a structure that's meant to enhance and specifically target habitat for endangered species or commercially important fish. If the local community is looking for tuna, then can we create habitat for the herbivorous fish that those fish feed on, right? And can we do it in a lower cost way, in a way that's compatible with the existing bottom habitat and that allows for smart maintenance, right? So that's some of the things we're looking at today with offshore wind. Really excited about the opportunity and to apply some of the things we've learned on the coastal space into the deep water world. And from monitoring, that really allows us to start to connect these ecosystems. So coastal ecosystems are connected to your deep water ecosystems. And if we're doing monitoring on both, we can really start to understand how to engineer these systems so that they're less impactful and less damaging to the natural ecology. So, in a perfect world, there would be nothing. There would be no disturbance whatsoever. If you can, vegetative approaches are always best. But if you do need that hardened structure, we want to be smarter than rock and do things that are compatible with the shoreline systems. So let me just kind of pause there. A lot of content really fast. So I have a couple concepts on coral as well, but let me just, I think it's right about at the half hour. So any thoughts or questions that from the audience?
Leonard, thank you so much. I think we could go to some questions, but if you did want to share a couple slides on coral, that might be something of interest as well to the audience. So, so maybe we can open up with a couple questions and then come back to the coral after, if you'd like. Take a little break from talking.
Yeah, that works.
Okay, great. Yeah, really fascinating stuff. I'm not going to lead off questions that as I usually do because I'm quite familiar with what you're doing. But in terms of so there were a bunch of benefits that you mentioned. Oh, and by the way, anyone with questions, please write them into the chat, and or raise your hand. And we'll just pick on you. We're a very tight group here, small group. So you can also just unmute your microphone and ask a question as well. While people are thinking of questions, for me, the ecological value of the sort of restoration is great. So obviously it's a lower cost solution, less maintenance. Is there any way to sort of monetize the ecological benefits, or is it just in reduced permitting time and things like that? And right?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So there's two models that we've thought of. One kind of touches on the coral concept that we'll dive into a bit in a minute. But the first one, the most immediate one, is there may be. So for example, in energy services, there are high voltage power lines that run through wetlands, and they're bringing in equipment to maintain, and that equipment can create erosion, and you can get what's called turnouses or blowouts, where erosion will start to divert and destroy parts of the natural wetland systems. So the typical approach today is you wait and wait and wait because it's an expensive fix, and then you blast a bunch of rock out of a mountain and you dump it on the ground in order to stabilize it, but that further destroys your wetlands, right? That causes issues. Wetlands are an incredible carbon sink, and when you look at some of our clients are getting to the point where they're looking for net zero projects. So we can come in with a project. Let's say you have 10,000 tons of rock. Maybe we can do that with 1,000 tons of our material. And we've actually been working on some low carbon mixes that have lower embodied carbon. So maybe we're down to 250 tons of carbon versus a much more carbon intense, embodied carbon. So your carbon footprint's really low on the project, and maybe we buy some offsets to offset that. But when you start to look at the secondary impact of what happens with those secondary wetlands, if you can save 1,000 acres of wetlands, and it's 10 tons per acre or whatever, you're starting to get a secondary impact on the habitat response. And so we've got a pending potential contract or SBIR with NSF. We're at least finalists at this point. We kind of are hoping to get the award of using multispectral drones to measure the wetlands impact and to kind of cross correlate with traditional ecological monitoring like stem counts. And that would allow us to kind of put that into a financing vehicle, like a pay for success bond, or to do carbon credits for, based on the baseline differences in wetlands value. So we think that could happen. You can also accrete carbon or store carbon in sessile organisms like coral and like oysters. But it's all about doing the math, right? And getting the actual data into the system. So I think the first answer is, in an infrastructure world, we think the answer is likely yes, if we're able to do the math, which I think we can. And then in the more coral world, we think there's a way that we can create experiential ways to do dual use projects. So if you've got, let's say in Bermuda, you need to do a rock breakwater because of hurricane issues, maybe we can combine that infrastructure project that has to be done anyway, and then find ways to get sponsorship of coral restoration and smarter designs onto that. And we've got some ideas and some initial data points on how we can monetize the ecological side.
Great. Yeah. We can go back to coral and infrastructure in a bit, but Melissa Moy had some questions. So Melissa, over to you.
Sure. Hi, great presentation. I just was curious how much international work you're doing. And also you mentioned sustainable impact bonds. I'm not sure whether that was just a possible source of financing, and what are you doing? You actually did mention some ways that you're tracking impacts, but are there things you're doing that would put you in a good position to use that kind of financing?
So I believe that there are. So our clients are telling us two things. One is that they need turnkey solutions because their existing service providers, if you're a multi-billion-dollar asset owner, whether you're a real estate investment trust with a bunch of coastal hotels or an energy services firm with a lot of exposed assets, they have their existing ecosystem, existing engineers who know how to do things the old way. So they want turnkey, right? And they have big asset bases that have lots of problems. So they might have 500 sites that they need projects done over the next 10 years. And the problem is they're doing it out of their balance sheet, or out of their income statement. So every year they've got their income statement, they're taking their net profit, and they're running around fixing their asset base with income statement dollars. They'd like to shift that to the balance sheet. So if they've got, let's say they've got $5 billion in replacement asset value on their balance sheet, they'd much rather borrow at low cost, $250 million, and have a plan so that they can do those types of projects over time. And that gives us a long-term service, right? Dependable long-term service that we can do nature-based solutions on their asset base over time and respond as nature and as habitat responds. And the monitoring that we're doing right now in terms of drone-based monitoring and kind of natural ecological monitoring and the normal site surveys we do, that can allow us to kind of to characterize the habitat systems and the ecological services we're providing, quantify those, and then tie that back into some sort of an impact bond. So I'd say that when we started this accelerator, we were probably 1 million miles away from that. We just had a printer, and now we're really to the point where we've got proof of concept on that as a model, and customers that are raising their hands saying, yeah, we're actually really interested in this. We would cut you a contract to do maintenance on, these energy lines for us, for example. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I also recommend you look at transition bonds. There's a lot of talk in the marketplace about that now, and I think your model would work really well with what some of the companies are looking at.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. So anybody that has, and we don't have a lot of expertise in that area. So Melissa, or you, or anybody else, know people that are in that world, and early conversations are always helpful and allows us to bring a more complete solution to our clients. I always say that if you can bring a solution and the money, you're in a better spot than if you can just bring a solution.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't want to dominate, but the international question, are you working international?
We were before COVID hit. Honestly, since kind of COVID started at the beginning of the accelerator, travel kind of slowed down, and we've been focusing mostly in the U.S. But our plan is to really kind of jump back out, particularly in the Caribbean and in Northern South America. Nothing yet in Asia or Africa or Europe.
But open to suggestions. That's what I was going to say. Open to contacts and suggestions for sure.
And one other thing, our new printer that we have is a Connex-based printer that will be at a deep water port. So we can launch out to respond to a hurricane or a natural disaster. And so we can launch out globally, if necessary by the end of the year.
Great, thanks. Maybe over to Romas.
Hi, Romas.
If you want to unmute yourself, there you go.
Yeah, sorry, David, I just have a bad connection, and sorry, great question from Melissa. Unfortunately, I didn't hear the entire response, but just wanted to ask if you're familiar, CPIC has a blueprint on environmental impact bonds for coastal resilience. So just wanted to first check if you're familiar with that. If not, I can send that along. Could just be helpful for your thinking about how to structure an environmental impact bond for your work. But the question that I have is kind of related to Melissa, because you probably won't have much opportunity unless you are working internationally. But have you done anything or thoughts about doing things with mangroves?
So to your first question, I'm not familiar with that framework. If you could send it, that would be amazing. And to the mangrove, we do have a patent on a mangrove targeted product. So we've invested quite a bit in it. And yeah, we haven't done no projects in the ground yet, but we're chomping at the bit to do it. So we've got the printer, we've got a specific mangrove protection patent that's meant to enhance mangroves. So kind of a replacement of a rock revetment, which would just, kind of rock dumping on the shoreline. So we've got a lot of ideas on how we can incorporate mangroves, but we haven't done a project yet. So would love to jump into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll speak. I don't know if you've connected at all with kind of this. We have a Great Green Infrastructure Fellow at CI, and looking a lot at mangroves. I don't know if you connected with us before on that. If not, it would be good to make those connections. We are working a lot on both mangrove conservation and also restorations. And very open, given the fact that we actually have a fellow on green infrastructure, we're clearly very open to the type of work you're doing.
Excellent. Yeah, love to connect.
I'll put you guys in touch.
There's a question
from Cyril.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead. It's absolutely fine. We're
Hi.
open.
And thank you so much for the presentation. That was really interesting. So I was wondering, since the benefits of your approach are very clear, what's your biggest challenge in winning projects at the moment? So if you're competing on projects and not always winning, which I assume must happen, what are the reasons that your clients give you to explain why they didn't choose your solution?
So I'd say our first problem that we ran into is the route to market. We went to contractors, and then we realized eventually that we have to go to the asset owner that capture their attention, and they tell the contractors what to do. So now that we've crossed that bridge, the biggest impediment is, part of it is our own production capacity. Sometimes the customer will say, oh, great, I got a perfect project. I need 40,000 tons of material. Whoa, we're not quite there yet. Maybe next year we can get there. So that's one that we're quickly addressing with our scale up. But another one is just trust, right? Just, people don't change approaches that fast, and they're used to dumping rocks on things. They know what a rock is, they know how to design it. So we've spent a lot of time, we've got a rock replacement document. So if there's engineers or construction firms or big asset owners or resort hotel chains, whatever, we've developed a document that helps them to understand this is what you do with rock, this is how you think of it, and this is how you get comfortable enough to change. So I think I would say that the comfort level of just switching from something that's trusted is probably the biggest thing. There's other issues like, permits and things like that, but I think those are the biggest things at the moment.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I mean, what we're all over the world, of course, there's all this investment in infrastructure, and it's all being planned and implemented by, these engineering firms, and engineering firms are full of engineers that studied, the mechanical engineering. They're not ecologists. They haven't, maybe now there's more green training and some engineering and architecture firms and stuff, but traditionally it hasn't been. So it's a real uphill battle. And so I'd be interested to hear, Leonard, in terms of, what, when we initially talked about trying to build, trying to convince those decision makers at the asset owners that to go in this direction. What do you think is the most compelling argument? I love the visualization piece. I think that's really going to be powerful when you start implementing that. But what are the how can we globally promote this kind of integrated gray-green infrastructure approach, which is desperately needed given the scale of coastal infrastructure, for example, that's being put in place?
So I think that there's two levels, kind of a barbell approach maybe. And maybe I'll touch on the slides on coral, because I think there's two elements of it. And one reason we were attracted to the CFA in the first place is I think part of it is how do you finance, right? These big CapEx projects, they drive a lot of that material, a lot of that big hockey stick of concrete and rock that are going in the ground are financed. And when you break it down and look at, how much are you really saving by just pouring concrete everywhere versus doing something with a nature-based approach, you're really not saving that much, right? The lever on the interest rate is much more important. So I think if we can, move towards I think there's been some great comments today from everybody in the group on, how can we move towards some sustainable financing? And, I think we can couple a solution that has community benefit and fixes people's asset base or helps with asset integrity that is at the same cost of financing or lower. I think that's half the battle. And then the other battle, I think, is this interesting kind of dichotomy of tangible assets versus intangible assets. So, doing a project in a marsh somewhere or a beach or a coral environment, you're putting something tangible in the ground, but there's an intangible effect of that. There's imagery, there's aesthetics, and the question is, how can we package and distribute the intangible component of those projects and monetize it? So one thing I often like to bring up, I actually had it on my desk from a meeting. We launched these shoes with Adidas. I was involved with this launch. This is before Natrx, but part of the inspiration for us starting this business in the way that we did, we put a chip in here so that you can tap it with your phone, and it's made of partially recycled ocean waste. And we did a 5,000 shoe drop, and we got, I think, 250,000 social impressions within the first week. And this shoe line or this parlay line has gone on to sell over $1 billion in revenue. Massive, massive, massive commercial success. And what it does is it's taking an intangible asset of that ocean waste story. And when you tap your phone to this shoe, you're able to see that this shoe came from this boat. And here's how we recycle the waste. And you're just packaging this $150 pair of shoes. And for every single one, like 20 bucks goes into ocean waste recycling. So that's an example of packaging a real tangible asset with, an intangible asset and massive success. And before COVID, we tested it out with coastal restoration. And we did a one-day event at a brewery. And we said, hey, if you want to restore part of the coast, get an extra beer for a Reef. And we raised $18,000 in one day at a Charlotte brewery. IPAs or whatever, just regular, it wasn't even announced, no radio coverage, 18 grand. So I think that people want, I mean, they want to do something to do things better, but they can't buy it. So how can we package tangible infrastructure construction projects and then piggyback or caboose on an intangible thing that somebody can subscribe to? You know, I want to subscribe $10 a month, or I want to pay $20, you know, on top of my scuba diving fee that in whatever region. And I'm just going to add on to this project that you already have to pay for anyway for a breakwater, but we're going to skin it with coral restoration, right? So I think that's where we want to go from. So again, I think it's two sides. So what's the bottom up, which I think is where the real money is, because then there's a lot of demand for that. And then from the asset owner side, municipalities, sovereign nations, commercial entities, how do we finance it differently, right? And I think if we can meet in the middle, that's where we get into scale. That's where we get into something that can actually move the needle.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I don't know if there are other questions, but you have a chance now. Melissa suggested you maybe want to contact the Global Mangrove Alliance and or be connected. Melissa, do you want to share a little bit about transition bonds and how that would work in this situation?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on transition bonds, but what it is basically it's come out in the last, I would say, about 2 years. BNP Paribas, if you Google it, they did some early work, but the idea is basically that you focus on industries that are seeking to make a transition from, you know, carbon emitting or heavy carbon emitting to more sustainable solutions. So what makes it a bit controversial is that these are companies that are not necessarily good players from an environmental point of view. And so you're financing, and the reason I thought of your company, Leonard, is because I saw who your client base was. So if your client base is oil companies, it's oil companies, mining companies who are exactly the ones needing to make a transition. And so therefore, you're basically financing through a bond a better, whether it's technological solution or some other solution that will lead to better outcomes, but it might not be like doing away entirely with what they're already doing. And so that's where it's a bit controversial. But I think what we're seeing in sort of the overall green bond market is just a segmenting, you know, with social bonds, sustainable impact, green bonds, and to me, transition bonds is just another market segment. But it's worth looking at just because of the type of business that you're in.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at some of our customers like Shell, for example, it's kind of two buckets. One is the traditional, and that is controversial, right? And then you've got the offshore wind, which is less controversial for green financing, but honestly, it has a huge environmental impact, right? I mean, you're millions and millions of tons of armory and concrete and steel, you know, going into very sensitive areas. So I mean, I think you're exactly right. I think it's finding the right investor base, you know, for what needs to be financed and looking honestly at the problems, because the Shell just can't drop the existing infrastructure that in some cases that those assets are already there and legally they have to maintain them, and it's the right thing to do to finance, you know, nature-based solutions to protect communities from oil spills and things like that from existing infrastructure. But not everybody wants to invest in that, right? Maybe it's a different investor base for an offshore wind concept. But I think you're exactly right. So I think that's great feedback.
Excellent. Well, last chance for a question, and maybe just a final sum up, Leonard. I don't see any other questions coming in, but well, I just want to thank Natrx for participating in the CFA Incubator. It's been a pleasure to work with you all, and for it seems from my perspective that you have great opportunities ahead, and we're very excited to continue supporting it and promoting it and making introductions. So congratulations on everything you've been doing.
Well, thank you, David. And yeah, I want to thank everybody else that joined. And it's good to have some fellow travelers on the road of doing things a little bit differently and doing it unique. And I'd say that, you know, on our side, we have the ability to do things large scale, low cost, and environmentally more compatible, I would say. And so it's not right for every situation, not right for every purpose. But those of you that have more of a financial bent, more of a financial side to your offerings, you know, we'd love to have further conversations and love to partner up. It's something that you know, we know that it can be done, but we're still learning a lot about how we could better help, you know, finance what we're doing. And to a certain extent, it's a shame that you can get an instant, you know, line of credit to pave your backyard with concrete and make a basketball court, but it's much more tricky to finance a living shoreline. So that's just the way it is. So we're kind of looking forward to any discussions on how we can keep pushing forward, and definitely would like to thank David and the entire team of the CFA for all the mentorship and guidance and support as we've grown over the last year.
Great. Well, again, thanks everyone for joining, and thanks to Leonard and Richard and Natrx for great work, and look forward to meet the next webinar and see you all again very soon.
Thank you so much, David. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.